You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thanks for joining Revolution 250, where we look at events that took place 250 years ago this week. This is from the American Revolution Podcast, just a short bonus episode to remind you about these important anniversaries from the Revolutionary War. This week, we remember the Battle of Bunker Hill. In June of 1775, the besieged British Army at Boston had received reinforcements along with 3 new generals. The most senior general to arrive was William Howe. The new leaders were critical of what they regarded as the commanding general Thomas Gage's timid approach with the rebels. The first thing they wanted to do was take the high ground north of the city at Bunker Hill and to the south at Dorchester Heights. Up until this time, the British had an understanding with the rebel militia that both sides would leave these heights as no man's land. When the Provincial Army learned of the British plans to take the heights, they decided to act first. They formed a detail to sneak onto Charlestown Peninsula after dark on June 16th and begin to build defensive works. These defenses would have to be in place by morning, June 17th. The British had planned to begin their offensive on June 18th. The provincial commander gave field command to Massachusetts Colonel William Prescott for the occupation of the hill. An experienced combat officer, Prescott had seen action as a militia officer in both King George's War and the French and Indian War. On the evening of the 16th, Prescott led about 1,000 Massachusetts militia onto the Charlestown Peninsula. He had orders to set up a defensive line on Bunker Hill. Joining the Massachusetts militia were about 200 Connecticut militia. Connecticut General Israel Putnam joined the Connecticut militia assigned to the mission. Although he outranked Colonel Prescott, Putnam did not try to assume command. Prescott remained in charge of the mission. Once the men arrived on the site, they decided to fortify Breed's Hill instead of Bunker Hill. Breed's Hill was not as elevated. It stood closer to Charlestown Village and the harbor. The Provincials' presence there would present a threat to the British Army and Navy, since heavy artillery could hit Boston from there, as well as ships in Boston Harbor. Breed's Hill also made an easier target for the British artillery. The new location made any retreat more difficult, as defenders would have to retreat up Bunker Hill before they could cross Charlestown Neck and back to the main army. Now, there's no good reason why they made this last-minute location adjustment. It may have been General Putnam that encouraged the more aggressive position, and that certainly seems in keeping with his character. In any event, the men began digging entrenchments and fortifications on Breed's Hill at around midnight. Now, the British in Boston became aware of the activity almost as soon as it began. Even so, they opted to wait until morning to react. They didn't want to make an unplanned night attack against an unfamiliar enemy. At dawn on June 17th, the British saw the Provincials hard at work fortifying Breed's Hill. The Navy began firing on the hill, but with little impact. General Howe led a detachment of several thousand soldiers across the river to Charleston. This move took hours. It took even longer when Howe decided he needed all of his support troops before he would even begin an initial assault. As the Americans watched the buildup of the enemy over several hours, they also asked for reinforcements. The provincial general, Artemas Ward, refused. He was still concerned that he would need the bulk of his army to deploy to Dorchester Heights. As a result, the number defending Breed's Hill continued to fall as exhausted men who had worked all night deserted back to Cambridge. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that the British were ready to make their assault. By 3 o'clock, the only action they had taken was to have the Navy burn down the town of Charleston, since snipers were using the buildings to shoot at the British Army. The first assault on Breed's Hill focused on the American right flank, where Howe hoped to get behind the main American defenses. The British soldiers ran into Colonel John Stark's New Hampshire regiment, which used devastating fire to hold back the advancing British, inflicting massive casualties. When that assault failed, Howe called for a direct assault on the American center. Once again, the British made it partway up the hill before falling into disorder under withering American fire. Finally, Howe ordered a third assault, this time with unloaded muskets. This prevented his regulars from firing early and breaking ranks. They would have to march into the American lines and use bayonets to end the battle. The Americans up until this time had taken relatively few casualties. But the men on Breed's Hill were exhausted. They had fought off 2 assaults after digging their defenses all night. They were also mostly out of ammunition. The Provincials had sent more reinforcements to support them, but the soldiers were afraid to cross Charlestown Neck, where the British Navy was using grape shot and chain shot to cut down anyone who tried. Those who did cross mostly stayed back on Bunker Hill, leaving the smaller force on Breed's Hill to fend for itself. Eventually, British Marines forced their way into American defenses while taking a horrific number of casualties in doing so. Hand-to-hand combat inside the American redoubt led to a bloodbath. General Joseph Warren vowed to be the last man to leave the redoubt, covering the retreat of his soldiers by holding off the British with his sword. A British officer shot Warren with a pistol, and regulars then rushed and bayoneted his body to make sure he was dead. The Provincials took most of their casualties for the day during this retreat. The British fired repeated volleys as the survivors ran across an open field up Bunker Hill. On Bunker Hill, Putnam attempted to rally a second line, but even he could not stem the panicked retreat over Bunker Hill and back across Charlestown Neck. Having captured the defenses on Breed's Hill, Howe did not pursue. His army was in disarray, and most of his officers were dead or wounded. It was now near evening. General Clinton had crossed into Charlestown without orders, bringing even more reinforcements. But they were too late to engage. The remaining provincial forces retreated across Charlestown Neck back toward Cambridge, leaving the peninsula completely in British control. The battle was over. A Bunker Hill is considered a British victory since the regulars successfully took the hill and took control of the Charlestown Peninsula. But it was a costly victory. The British suffered more than 1,000 dead and wounded. The British officers took an especially big hit, with over 80 of them killed or wounded. If you don't count Clinton's late arrivals, we're talking nearly a 50% casualty rate. It would be the deadliest battle of the war for the British. Generals Howe and Piggott somehow emerged unscathed, although all of Howe's 12 aides, who marched right alongside him, were either killed or wounded. While the British won the battle, they learned that the Provincials would stand and fight. Like British leaders before them, the new generals now understood taming the American rebellion would be no easy task. In a letter following the battle, Gage wrote, quote, "The loss we have sustained is greater than we can bear. Small armies can't afford such losses, especially when the advantage gained tends to little more than the gaining of a post." The Americans took about 450 casualties that day. There were only about 30 of them taken prisoner, and 20 of those died in captivity, likely due to serious wounds before their capture. General Gage had planned to take Dorchester Heights following the capture of Bunker Hill, but the casualty rates from the battle changed his mind. His army would occupy and entrench Bunker Hill, but they would not attempt to take any more land from the Provincial Army. Gage decided against any further assaults. Both armies buried their dead and treated their wounded, a larger percentage of which would die over the next few weeks, given the state of military medicine. Officials in London blamed General Gage for the disaster and ultimately recalled the general, making Howe the new commander in America. I hope you've enjoyed this Revolution 250 moment. For more of the story, please check out episodes 65 and 66 of the American Revolution podcast.